So I thought we might have a little look through this Edwardian child's tea dress. It's a little stained and a little torn, but I think there's still a lot to be seen in it. Tea dresses are not exactly rare. Every museum has at least a couple of these, and usually they're in much better shape than this one is. But anyway, the general backstory. At the turn of the last century, women could have changed into a handful of different dresses throughout the day. There were morning dresses, walking suits, evening gowns. This one is a tea dress or lawn dress. They were lightweight, sometimes made out of linen, but more often out of cotton, like this one is. It was something comfortable to change into after the heavier outfits that were worn in the mornings to run errands, but before getting dressed up more formally for dinner. Afternoon tea was a time of relaxation and refreshment, of gardens and casually socializing in soft lace dresses. Do I hear little feet? Hey, baby. So, without any further ado, let's get started. We'll start up here with the collar. The collar is made of an insert lace. It's not one piece of lace, it's actually three. The outsides are a very fine and narrow needle lace. The inside is a bobbin lace. The bobbin lace pattern itself is just a braided background with a cloth stitch running through. It's a fairly simple pattern. Attached to that is a ruffle made of the same fabric as the rest of the dress, and another piece of bobbin lace with a scalloped edge, polka dots, also with a braided background, and some picots along the very outside. It's attached to the yoke, just whip stitched. Everything appears to just be whip stitched through. And the sewing patterns, you can see that it's all just kind of rolled hems and whip stitched throughout the entire piece. The back of the collar has two buttons with button loops. The button loops are just buttonhole stitched on, but the lace itself has been rolled over and sewn. The rest of it just turned and running stitched. Has some little buttons on the other side, same sewing on the other side. The yoke is covered in these little tucks. They actually change direction in the middle. All these are coming in, all these are coming in. Same on the back. These all go this direction, those all go that direction. It becomes untucked and is just turned under and running stitched to close. The whole entire dress is hand stitched, and what I find absolutely fascinating about these tucks is that in some places more than others, they are very, very uniform, and it is very similar to what you read in sewing instruction books of the time, where you would grab two threads, skip four threads, grab two threads, skip four threads. In this case, the most common pattern seems to be 3 and 3 and 3 and 3. And to think that every thread on this entire dress, because these tucks are everywhere, has been counted. By a person. I think that's absolutely amazing. Yeah, stunning. Especially when this one, if you look at it compared to other ones, this is a relatively plain tea gown. Most of them are much more elaborate than this is. And so, I mean, even on this comparatively simple tea gown, it's still amazingly complex if you get down to the actual stitch work. Absolutely incredible. So there's the yoke. The yoke is one piece with this ruffle attached to it. You can see the tucks continue down. It attaches to the bodice of the dress with this little open work trim. It also is a separate piece of trim, and each piece was just attached to it. You can see again, it's just rolled and whipped together. The ruffle is just sewn onto the yoke with this really beautiful little embroidery stitch to kind of flatten it and make it a prettier transition. We have the same insertion lace pattern as the collar was. It's this narrow needle lace with the bobbin lace interior. And then this same outer needle lace is used to define the points in the edge between this part and the ruffle. The ruffle itself is more gathered along the points, less gathered up around the top, more gathered around the points. That is to keep it, it keeps the bottom lace very even. If you had the same amount of ruffling here, it would be super, super ruffly up here and very flat along the point. So it's gathered more along the points than at the top to give it a more even look. In the back, they just left this outer insertion lace, the needle lace, be its own edge, and then turned and hemmed with a simple running stitch. It's not a back stitch, it's definitely a running stitch. Just turned and hemmed. Same thing with this bobbin lace edging down here, just turned and running stitched. Underneath it all, it's attached to the bodice with this extra piece of open work. You have the same insertion lace, tucks, insertion lace, insertion lace, tucks, insertion lace. All the tucks are pointing to the center. We have a band where it is not tucked, and then a band where it is, another band where it's not tucked, and another band where it is, and then it meets the skirt at a drop waist. There's some red rubbing stain here. I would imagine that that is because there was a red sash around it. You can see how it was not exactly elegantly sewn onto the skirt. And this is because it would have been covered with a sash. And also because it's a drop waist, it would have sat like this and it would have been kind of poofed out over. These pleats will contribute to that little poof. Having it be pleated under and then open over gives it that kind of round bodice look of the turn of the century. Let's see. So it's sewn onto the skirt here. The top of the skirt fabric is raw. It's unfinished. It's about an inch of overhang, and yeah, it's just kind of a raw finish. The bodice itself is rolled and finished. You can see that's that same roll whip stitch that's used throughout. The skirt gathering is much flatter in the front than it is in the back. It's much more gathered in the back than it was in the front. We have that weight of fabric in the back that the Edwardians are kind of known for. Next, we'll follow the skirt down to the bottom ruffle part, which I think is just the most beautiful part of the entire dress. It has tucks, insertion lace, more tucks, more insertion lace, more tucks that come to a pointed edge, and the same embroidery from the ruffle around the top. The points are emphasized with the narrow needle lace that's found in the insertions. Then you have ruffles, which again are more gathered at the points than they are at the tops, and this whiter bobbin lace. It's very similar to the bobbin lace at the top. Very similar pattern to the collar bobbin lace, but whiter. You have the polka dots and the scallops. You have polka dots and scallops. It is exactly the same as the ruffle along the yoke. Unlike the top of the dress, this embroidery doesn't actually serve a purpose. It's not holding anything down or anything. It's just decorative. Okay, so something to notice about this dress is how it's pieced together. Because if I were just to make a child's dress, that especially one that opened along the back, I would run a seam that ran down the back, but there isn't one. It's actually seamed twice, pretty much under each arm. So it's just a little behind. This is the underarm seam. This is the skirt seam. It doesn't run through the entire ruffle. So you can see it runs through the majority of the ruffle, and this tucks, this lace, and this tucks. It skips this row of inserts and finishes off with these tucks too, for whatever reason. Something that's interesting about this is that it was tucked after it was pieced together. So I would have thought that you would have a length of tucked fabric, and you would cut off however much you need for the skirt and sew it together. But in this case, as you can see, they cut the length of the skirt and then tucked it in. There's the French seam here. They tucked it all up, sewed it onto the lace. This lace is not rolled and running stitched like it is in other places. This is done with a buttonhole stitch. It's like the only place that something isn't whip stitched together. It's actually got a buttonhole stitch instead. Coming to the back, again, there is no seam running down. There's a bit of a gather here to accommodate for a turned over edge. There isn't a placket, it's just simply turned and sewn with a running stitch. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buttons that run up the back with buttonholes. And then 2 more. Oh, where are you? And then 2 more buttons that close the collar with the buttonhole stitched button loops. Next, let's take a look at the sleeves. The sleeves were originally sewn with this corded trim here between the yoke and the sleeve fabric. And then it was kind of loosely tacked together. This creates a big pleat here, or a big tuck here inside. There are a couple different reasons for this. One, my first thought was that it was just a hand-me-down, and the next child who wore it was smaller, and so they took the sleeve up. It kind of, I don't know, it's also possible that it was done to give the sleeve a little more shape, because that stitching would have been hidden underneath the ruffle. And we know that elsewhere, things that aren't hidden tend to be less elegant than the things that are seen, and you were going to cover it anyway. That might be one of the reasons. But for whatever reason, definitely after the fact, that was tacked up. We have more of these pleats. This part of the sleeve is not gathered onto the dress. You can see it's flat sewn the entire way around. Where the gathering happens is after the insertion. So the insertion, you have the same pattern for most of it. You have the narrow needle lace, which you can see is the weak point. This is where it's just kind of pulling apart. And then we have the bobbin lace. The insertion, the outside insertion is here in the front. This would be just in the front of the arm, and it's there while this is flat. Once this is starting to be gathered and whatever it's sewn onto is going to have more tension on it, they took out the needle lace insertion and let it sew directly onto the bobbin lace. Bobbin lace is actually a very strong lace. So this is the shoulder. The highest gathering point is not at the shoulder itself, but actually about halfway down the back of the sleeve. That's when it's the most gathered. The front of the sleeve is fairly flat. And then you have the shirt seam run down, which would actually run down this part of the arm. Not on the inside. The point is not on the back. It runs down the center, and then the point is right there. Right, so here we are at the cuff. This is the front of the arm. It has a point of this narrow needle lace. You can see it's actually not gathered very much, and then it leads into these tucks. The gathering starts to pick up drastically by the time you get here to the back, and then it drops off again as it comes up. The seam for the cuff does not match up with the seam for the sleeve, because this is the front most decorative part. We have tucks. We have that same insertion lace pattern, ruffle, and narrow bobbin lace. 2 more of the same buttons that are on the back of the dress. This is actually a closed cuff. As you can see, there's no opening here, so it's just made wide. And then these little buttonhole loops, same as on the back of the dress, they're just a buttonhole stitch, would have come over to close it up. So there we have it. Thank you for watching as we explored our way through this sweet little dress. My name is Bryce, and I hope that I inspired you to perhaps add a little historical detail to your own works of art. Or maybe you've seen hundreds of tea dresses and it was nothing more than a hopefully pleasant way to spend some time. Either way, I hope to see you again soon. Bye. Try that again. The back of the skirt here, there is no hem running down. But it's not a hem, it's a seam. You're distracting me. All right, so that's our little dress. All right. Do you want to look at a book? Here, come look at a book. Look at Patterns of Fashion. That'll work.